Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à cette discussion organisée dans le cadre de la 23e édition des RIDM qui se déroule actuellement en ligne jusqu'au 2 décembre. Mon nom est Apolline Caron-Ottavi, je suis programmatrice au festival. La discussion qui va suivre porte sur deux films, Stray, qui est présenté dans le cadre de la section Explorer la nature du 12 au 18 novembre, et 499, présenté dans le cadre de la section Confronter l'histoire, également du 12 au 18 novembre. Comme la discussion va se dérouler en anglais, permettez-moi de changer de langue pour vous présenter nos invités. I'm very pleased to be discussing today with Elizabeth Lowe, which is a filmmaker behind Stray. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
As well as Rodrigo Reyez, which is the filmmaker behind 499. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start the discussion, please let me introduce briefly your films. In Stray, the camera follows a few stray dogs, especially Zeytin, Nazar, and Kartal, through the streets of Istanbul, offering us a new perspective on society. Through an immersive approach, we discover their territory and habits, as well as the humans around them, from Turkish workers to young Syrian refugees. And now we can watch the trailer of Stray. In 499, a conquistador from Cortés' army is shipwrecked on a Mexican shore in the present day, 5 centuries after the conquest of the Aztec Empire. In this hybrid dystopian film, part reality and part magic realism, we follow him as he discovers the specter of colonialism and has to listen to the victims of violence in modern Mexico.
Estoy muerto.
Llegaste casi 500 años después. ¿Qué te trajo a nuestro tiempo?
Entramos a un pueblo y de inmediato arrasamos los templos.
Lo he buscado durante 5 años. Yo no me resigno a esperar.
Por mis oídos entran voces que me llaman.
Era periodista y aparte era activista. Por cualquiera de las dos te matan.
Mi hijo tiene 5 años, 4 meses que no se debe. Es una obligación de ellos protegerlo.
Vemos primero la zona, el tipo de suelo, si tiene olor a putefacto, ahí resto.
¿Con qué derecho esclavizaba yo a mis hermanos? ¿Qué será de mí?
¿Está bonita?
Porque si yo en ese momento hubiera dicho sí, ellos estuvieran muertos. Me hubieran pagado lo que le hicieron a mi niña.
A los 17 años hice un examen para materiales de guerra, para incorporarme al colegio militar. Por dinero se sea lo que sea.
Me pregunto, ¿qué fue de mi riqueza? ¿Dónde quedó mi gloria?
So Now, to start the discussion, Elizabeth and Rodrigo, please feel free to add anything to that short introduction about your films. And also, maybe you can, to begin with, tell us about the starting points of those film projects. Elizabeth, do you want to be first?
Yeah. The film, how I began the film, it came from a very personal place. My own dog died. Actually, you see him in the portrait back there. And I remember feeling like I had to suppress my grief for his passing because he was a dog, even though he was also, you know, a part of my family growing up. And I think over time, as my grief evolved, I kind of realized how arbitrary the value is that we assign different beings. And so I wanted to explore sort of what it meant to live in a society full of hierarchies and where certain perspectives are devalued, but to use cinema to value it. And for me, that was following this stray dog and I discovered Istanbul, the city, in the course of my research to find out what kinds of societies really place dogs and integrate them in a different way than mine did. And that's how that's what led me to discover Istanbul and met Zeytin and went on this journey with her.
Rodrigo?
I just want to say I loved your film, Liz. I really liked it. I love dogs, and I was just like in love with the perspective. And you know, in 499, it comes also from a very personal place. Actually, my father is a historian, and so I remember being a little kid, like I'm talking like 4 or 5 years old, and going to the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, which some of you might know is an amazing museum, and going to some ruins, you know, and just being fascinated by history and asking myself, well, look, you know, how do you process this in really intense history that Mexico has had? And so as the 500th anniversary of the Big Bang moment, you know, Hernán Cortés taking over the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, as that was coming up, I was like, man, I have to make a movie. I have to make a movie. And in all the thinking and brainstorming, we came up with this idea of like, we need to confront history. We can't just do a didactic film. How do we make history come to life? And the solution was really simple, like just have this actor, you know, playing a conquistador who comes to modern Mexico. But then slowly we realized, you know, he could meet people, he could meet the victims of today's violence, and they could share their stories with him. And so the movie started growing like that. And it's just been a really interesting journey to make it, and now to release it and to speak with audiences about it.
And to continue on that idea, it's a thing your films have in common, which is the use of an external outside point of view to film society. The dogs in your film, Elizabeth, and the Conquistador. Can you tell us more in details about that approach and that choice?
Rodrigo, you can go since you're speaking already, but I also just want to express how refreshing the experience of watching your film was and how much I loved it too. Like it was such a bold approach, and just like cinematically, I felt involved and invested, even though I'm just passing through these people's stories through your protagonist.
Thank you. I'm glad that resonated. And you know, I think there is something to be said about these two films that step out away from the perspective of what you would expect. You know, like they give us a radically different perspective. And the Conquistador in 499, you know, he creates this need to constantly interpret his presence. As a viewer, you can't just laugh. It's not a comedy. He's forcing you always to think, why is he there? What is the connection? Why is he there? And if you go through the journey, I feel like it's very, very rewarding, you know? And if from my point of view, he's a very real character. He's a real ghost that lives in the Mexican subconscious and in our culture. So having him question the viewer and, you know, provoking these connections was just really powerful. And there was like something magic that happened when he was on screen with the regular people and with real life. So I think that's what, you know, film can really do, is like take you just right outside of what you think you should be saying or what you think you should be looking at, and just show you a completely different way. And in my case, all it took was, you know, a fabulous actor. He was fabulous, but you know, with a great costume. That's all it is. There's no special effects or anything. Yeah. So kicking it over to you, Liz, did you know I found the same kind of otherworldly, you know, experience watching your project.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the things I loved about your treatment of him is that he goes mute very early on in the film, and that's such an effective tool, because then he's forced to just bear witness. And I feel similarly about Zeytin, the dog, who had, you know, she howls and she barks, but, you know, from our human ears, she's in a way mute because she can't express her opinions. And so we're forced to just witness all the, you know, the things that she observes around her. And I always think, and I always believe this, and it's when you're viewing the world from the peripheries, from a place of powerlessness, and when, not powerlessness, but when you have been designated as lower in society, or you don't have the powers of the center and the establishment, that view of the world is so much more accurate than when you are powerful and in the center. So I think that's what also provoked me to want to follow a stray dog who, in this case, in this context, was, you know, sort of like the lowest member of a social fabric, the most disposable being you can think of in a city, and what society looks like from that viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And to follow up on that idea of margins and blind spots of society, you do it through the wandering, through a real exploration, a very strong exploration of space and urbanism and even geography in 499. Can we come back on that and on the social political reflection around space, cities, living places we sense in your films?
I think it's also how it is portrayed with a very specific point of view. You know, in your film, Liz, I kept thinking like, man, like this point of view is like so seductive and so intense. You know, you see things, everything from a low angle, from the dog's point of view, and it just radically changed the way you see how humans interact. And we were kind of going for something like that with 499 in terms of what are the eyes of this conqueror? Like, what does he see? What are the things that he is forced to witness? And we wanted to work with this anamorphic format because we felt it was like the language of epic, you know, traditional epic cinema, you know, like big Lawrence of Arabia type movies. And we had like a fraction of that budget, but we try to hack that look to really bring together reality and fiction, so that you don't know what did we provoke and what did we just find when we watch the movie, and it feels very dreamlike. And I see that also in your film in Stray. It's just like it feels like it's almost like the waking dream of one of the dogs, or all three of the dogs.
Yeah, I think this idea of wandering is really powerful, and it's also what really drew me to your film, because you don't know where the narrative is going. It doesn't fit into sort of conventional formulas or structures, even though I think there is this like overarching tension and mystery that is thrusting you forward. And that's what I really appreciated about it. And I think with Zeytin, also because she's a dog, it was unpredictable. We couldn't produce or pre-produce her story really, because dogs, they don't necessarily, you know, the stray dogs don't necessarily do anything. You know, their lives are, you know, dictated by the whims of what they smell and what they hear and what fascinates them in the moment. And what you were saying, Rodrigo, about this, the low angle and how that defamiliarizes what you're seeing, and like that was very intentional, in that we wanted to embody as much as possible a non-human height of seeing, but also for, like, I felt like it was viscerally a way to challenge conventional modes of being and seeing, which was what the film was trying to do, decenter you, in our case, from this anthropocentric, domineering worldview that is so destructive. And I think in your case, obviously, it's like the colonial legacies and the Eurocentric worldview.
How did you manage to create the relationship with Zeytin and the other characters, the other dog characters, to have that comfort with you and your crew? I mean, I even on a technical level, I kept thinking, like, man, like, how did you rig the camera so that it's that low? Because it's like hard to be bending over for that long. So was it I kept thinking on the technical side, and then like just even on the relationship side, like you could tell that there was a really cool, really complete relationship between you and the dogs.
Yeah, I mean, technically it was I think it's just the ingenuity of the human form. I didn't figure out a rig that could go low easily, so I was crouching a lot of the time, and it was very backbreaking to be filming that way. But over time, my muscles kind of got used to it. I was just crouching low with the gimbal. And in terms of the relationships that the dogs had with each other, that was all organic, and that was kind of like why I was drawn to their stories, to sort of show like Zeytin and Nazar and Kartal, their lives were all intersecting, and they're all individuals within this urban space, occupying the same public spaces, the same marginalized spaces that are not private property, where strays are allowed to exist, and also in this case the refugees, and so that's what kind of drew me to the story, and also it's what organically held the story together.
And how did you build trust with them, with the dogs?
Dogs, I think, are really, I think the stereotype about dogs is true. If you treat them a certain way, and they'll treat you that way back. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Zeytin specifically is that a lot of the dogs that we like filmed with as we were casting the film, they would end up inadvertently following us back. They would attach to us and start following us. And the whole premise of the film was to see like where a non-human will would take you and where they would want to go. And Zeytin was one of the few dogs that always remained radically independent and did not care about what we wanted her to do, and we couldn't manipulate her. So that was kind of how she became sort of the star of the film.
Wow, that's amazing.
And how did you? I don't know. I will please, Apolline. I'm sure you have many questions, but I also have one for Rodrigo. How did you go about casting the protagonist to play
all the real people? Yeah, like I mean, when you watch the film, the testimonies seem so intense. They are intense. They're brutal, and they're visceral. But my approach was just to be radically transparent and say, hey, like, this is what a film I want to make. Like, this is where this character is going to meet you, and you're like at step one of the journey. He just got off the beach and he has to go all the way to Mexico City. So when he meets you, he's going to be kind of angry and vicious. And I also see your story as part of this larger story of violence that has been going on for 5 centuries, where the violence just reinvents itself but stays the same. You know, it's been going on in cycles, and so it's a way of sharing your story to this larger, happening. And when people responded to that, we built on that relationship, we built on that trust and that communication, and then allowed folks to also collaborate and like give their perspective on the film. So like in the movie, there's like a scene, like the third person that the conquistador meets is a poet, and the poet only speaks in poetry, doesn't do an interview, doesn't share any specific story. And that's how he wanted it. He was like, I want to share my poetry. I don't want to do an interview about indigenous issues or anything like that. I just want to share my poetry. I want him to carry that poetry with him on his journey. And so that ability to listen was like something we learned we needed to do really early on, because how do you convince someone to share their story of trauma? You know, they could look over and say, well, this guy's wearing a costume, he's like mocking me, you know, this is a joke. Because really that's like all the time traveling movies are about, they're funny, they're all like comedies, most of them, right? Like, and they're good comedies, but this isn't a comedy. So it just took a lot of transparency and a lot of listening, and I'm still in touch with most of the folks in the movie, actually.
Oh, great. I love that, allowing the film to be at the mercy of your participants and your subjects. I felt very much the same way. Mine.
And more generally, maybe you, Elizabeth, because Rodrigo, you talked a bit about it, but how did those, you know, getaways into reality through the dogs or through the conquistador played a role during the shooting? Maybe not with the people who give testimonies, but even in the streets for the conquistador, how did people react to that? Did it help you to enter into reality, and you with the dogs? How did people react to that shooting?
For sure. I think for me, it was weirdly like a huge benefit to be, I think, a foreigner, to look very explicitly like a foreigner in Turkey and not understand the language, because the film's premise, it's to observe society through a dog's point of view. It's very modest. I don't pretend to know deeply sort of, you know, what's happening in contemporary Turkish politics or to take a stance on that. And it's similar to the dogs. I couldn't understand what was being said a lot of the times. And so I was just registering minute facial expressions to see how close I can get with my camera to people. And I think because the film was following dogs and about dogs, it had this disarming quality that allowed me, because the dogs seemed so innocuous, and also because it seemed like I also didn't understand what was being said in people's private conversations, that people allowed me in and allowed me to, and gave me permission to film conversations, and were so open with each other and talking about their love lives or politics in a way that maybe they wouldn't have had I been from there, actually. So that was something that I noticed, the status of being in this liminal space of being an outsider, and for the dog and for me as a foreigner.
That's really interesting. A similar thing happened with us whenever people would see the character, you know, in his wardrobe. They would immediately just say, "Oh, this is a movie that has nothing to do with reality. These people are not investigating. They're not doing anything wrong." And that was great, because we had a lot of security concerns. It was an election year in Mexico, and we had a ton of worries that something would happen, you know, with our security. And it was so disarming to see the conquistador. And it was, you know, even enchanting. I think a lot of people would come and take pictures with the actor, or they would talk to us about what they knew about the history of that region. So it was a really interesting way of telling a very you know, a very powerful story, I guess, about like violence and all these issues, but without people really realizing that that's what we were doing when they would see us on the street. And it opened up a lot of doors. Like, people would just come and watch. We didn't get a lot of questions, you know, and it helped so much with the safety issues like us also.
On a very practical level, I also always felt very safe being around the dogs. I always felt protected, like in a weird way, like it felt like they could read my mind. Like when people were bothering me on the shoot, they would start, you know, there's a scene where Azaytun starts getting up and she starts barking at the camera seemingly. And it's because, you know, behind the camera, there's a guy who's talking to me and bothering me. And I only realized all of this retroactively when I was looking at the footage, understanding the motivations of these dogs.
I'd like to come back a bit on your creative approach. Stray is a very, very highly immersive film, very beautifully shot, and 499 is there is a lot of magical realism in it. How did you cope with the contrast between the reality, which is really rough, sometimes imprevisible, and the shooting of your film and your creative approach, your aesthetics?
Me? Okay. So I feel like the key is to have a language, to pick a language, a grammar really for cinema. In our case, we knew we had the anamorphic lenses and they limited a lot of what we could do. We had to really work in that aesthetic and build on it. So we would encounter reality, but then we would interpret it through our tools. And then there was like the element of the script, and then the tone of each scene, because I didn't have like a traditional script. I just had like emotional beats, and ideas of how to get to those emotional beats. But then I had to convince people or find it or figure out something else that would match and to be able to react. So like there's a scene in the film where the conquistador sees a horse in a field and he goes out and touches it. Well, the actor was playing with this horse and he was like, I bet you I could touch it. And we were like, well, let's film it. But we filmed it in our language, in the grammar of the film, so that it would fit. Because otherwise you have so many things happening in this like crazy trip through all these different regions of Mexico. Like we needed some unifying principle, like to hold the film together, because otherwise you spin out of control and then it doesn't work. The illusion that you're trying to create, or this hybrid, universe, just falls apart.
Yeah, for me, it was watching your film, the experience of seeing the anamorphic lens and all the associations that come with it put me in a place that, I don't know, I just, on just a tactile level, I really appreciated it. And it's the same with Stray. We were testing different like setups for how to best represent a canine experience. And, we tried GoPros, strapping them on dogs, but it was just too nauseating and too alienating when it was truly rough and tumble, true physical immersion with the camera. And then I kind of realized, like, the films that have also affected me the most, a lot of them tend to be fiction films. And you give, a long take on the back of an actress's head can be so evocative in a fiction film. The minutia that's often not, like, that benefit of the doubt is not offered in documentary or that kind of space. And so with this dog, this scrappy stray dog, I knew I wanted to sort of use the tools of cinema and the associations that come with it. And so we shot with, like, sometimes we would shoot with an Arri Alexa, a Mira, and then also vintage Cook lenses, which are lenses that have been traditionally used in Hollywood or independent films, so that that level of beauty and production value, even though it was still very DIY, would be afforded our stray dog subjects, so that in viewers' minds, it would elicit those kinds of associations, and maybe they would afford what they afford a human actress to Zeytin. So that was our sort of strategy behind the level of beauty to approach their world, because we were trying to help audiences get over whatever hump we imagined they might have in relating to this subject. But I've also feel very gratified that people are actually reading into Zeytin in the way that we had hoped, and far beyond what I thought possible for audiences. But I think that also
I fell in love with
dog
Zeytin.
human bond. Oh yeah,
Zeytin was amazing. Yeah, she was like just such a boss,
Yeah.
so brave, so noble.
Yeah.
It's interesting, how much we read into that iconography of dogs and how much they understand us through their evolution. Like they understand us like incredibly well, and you could see that in the film. You could see just they had this psychological insight into human beings. It was really great. I love all the peripheral conversations too. It's like snippets of conversation, and it made me think, like, man, all this stuff is so unimportant. Like, look at this dog living their life, and it just shows how like insignificant so many of our concerns are. I love that.
Completely. That I'm so glad that you got that that was the whole purpose. And yeah, she felt like, whereas your character is this ghost that is haunting this land, Zeytin for me was like this, this angel of humanity, guardian angel wandering and being wiser than the people around her.
Following on this, what strikes me in both your films is you were talking about emotions, Rodrigo, and empathy is really, really important in both your films. So there are two feelings for me: empathy and a bit of melancholy too. So it's at the same time hopeful and a bit sad. Could you come back on this, and did you expect the film to have this tone?
Okay, I knew it would have a certain so that empathy that you're talking about, that melancholy tone rather, that tone really comes from this idea of like he's like a failed knight, he's like a knight in armor. He's like a Don Quixote in a way, except he was chasing a nightmare. He wasn't chasing a dream of transforming the world for the better. He was chasing a very selfish dream. But I never hated the character. I never felt that, because these people came and conquered us, that somehow I should hate him as a Mexican. I think that idea is present in Mexican history, but it has done a lot of damage because it has helped to erase the responsibility of all the elites that came after the conquistadores. We've been independent for 200 years. So whose responsibility, I'm still here. So whose responsibility is it that things are the way they are, So I always felt a great respect for him at a human level, not for the things that he did, but for his potential, And I think that that's really important in the film, because to me, if we don't let people listen and learn, then there is no point to any kind of social justice fight, because it has to end in complete genocide of the other party, right? Because you have enemies and they're never going to learn, But the really brave thing is to have to listen, And I'm not saying my character is brave. He's not brave because he doesn't want to listen. He's forced to, But he's being taught what the hard thing is. The hard thing is to listen.
I loved that about the characterization of him, that he was this reluctant, in very traditional way. The film is following the hero's journey, where he's very reluctant to go on this path of transformation, where you hope that there's some kind of elixir at the end of it, although of course it's unresolved because it's ongoing, the traumas and how to deal with it. For me, with the stray dogs, I think when I would describe, I'm making a film about stray dogs, people would automatically say, that's so tragic, that's so sad. But for people who come from cultures where stray dogs are thriving and they haven't been eradicated from the streets, it's unimaginable for them to think of societies like ours, where if you don't have an owner, or if you can't hope to have an owner, you're either killed or incarcerated for the remainder of your life. And when I see how rich these lives are of the dogs, living on their own terms, even if they may be a little bit shorter than our pet dogs, it fills me with a lot of hope at sort of how rich life can be if you have a different concept of interspecies connection, have a different concept of allowing non-human beings to live on their own terms, to respect their agency in the way that I think Turkish society has come to, where it's illegal for the government to even hold in captivity any healthy stray dog, which would be a radical notion if you tried to implement that in New York. And so for me, the film is really a celebration of this kind of life, and also like a challenge in a way. Like, I hope this film functions as a decolonizing tool to Western audiences who see other countries that have stray dog populations as being the inhumane ones, to sort of realize, actually, no, like we're the insane ones. We're the ones who live in this world where it's this sterile, world where you don't maintain connections with other species other than through ownership. So that's, I think the melancholy is built in because, they're dogs and they're, the precarity of their existences, but I also want the film to be an assertion of their sort of resilience and that they have this right to exist beyond us.
In both films, there is a dialogue between past and present. In 499, it's very obvious. You are confronting history, and it's a lot of with the writing, the narration of the conquistador, what he's saying. And Elizabeth, also there is a dialogue between the past and the present through the quotes of Diogenes, the Greek philosopher. Could we come back on this dialogue and maybe on your literary influences, on your relation to writing?
I can begin because mine will probably take shorter than Rodrigo's. With Diogenes, he was a Greek philosopher, but he was actually born in the land of modern day, what's modern day Turkey now. And so I feel like, geography, of course, Turkey and Greece are very, very different, but geography and temperature, it shapes the culture. And this region has this particular relationship with dogs where Diogenes was asking us to look at, he modeled his whole philosophy on looking at dogs, asking us to use dogs to question our own customs, to realize what's relevant and irrelevant, to be more essential. And so for me, the film is also very much about capturing a time. For me, I sense this as an outsider because I've seen societies where stray dogs are no longer allowed to exist and are persecuted, that when a city modernizes or gets it in its head that this is uncivilized to have free animals around, that can disappear overnight. And I think as with the existence of all easily scapegoatable populations, this public sentiment can turn on a dime about a marginalized population. So for me, seeing these dogs and the rights that they have now in the city, for me, it was very precious to capture that because I don't know what will happen in 10 years or 50 years when Turkey maybe modernizes more, whether the governments will be able, or the powers that be, or the industries that be, will be able to turn people's minds against the dogs. Although I think a lot of Turkish people would argue this is our civilization that they've fought for their right to exist, and that will outlive any sort of regime that is ruling over them. But I'll let Rodrigo take this question.
I was just gonna say, I think like the dogs in Stray have they're like a constant ethical question, of like this very deep rooted notion in classical philosophy of like how to live the best life. And dogs in the film, like, especially there's some scenes in there where you overhear certain conversations that you're just like, man, like we make our lives so complicated and it's just so needless. Yeah, I love that about like that. It's like a philosophical conundrum, their presence, right, in the film. I really appreciated that connection to literature. To me, the Americas are full of writing about the conquest, especially from the Spanish and the Portuguese. And these chronicles are where magic realism really is born. It's like this idea of like, we're in this fabulous place and things are amazing. And like, it looks like this. And as they're trying to understand the world and their minds are kind of blowing up with all this new knowledge and all these new things and all these new ways of doing, they became fascinated with that. And I think at 499, I really was, I read a lot to make the film. I think my research period was like 2.5 years or something. And I talked to a lot of scholars about this concept of history that we have in Mexico and what should this character see? What should he learn? And I realized like, I could write anything into the movie. I could write anything. I could make him like the helper of Cortez, which he is. I could make him meet certain people, but I didn't want to kind of make like this crazy catalog of history. I just wanted it to be very subjective. but he writes himself into decisions throughout the film. You know, he's like, oh, I suggested to Cortez we should make an alliance. Oh, I used to talk to Cortez's interpreter, who was this very famous young woman who interpreted for them. And so like there's all these like you know, literary, you know, like grandparents to 499, you know, and we have so many amazing writers in Latin America that have dealt with this like play between time, you know, like Borges and Cortázar. But I also like kept writing throughout the whole film, from research to edit and post. Like, so like in the post-production, as we were recording the voiceover, I came across a letter that a poet wrote in Mexico in response to a massacre that happened, a very famous massacre where a Mormon family was attacked, and it was all over the news worldwide. And he wrote a letter because he was friends with that family, and he kept saying, it is time, it is time, it is time, you know, like it's time to change. And I just like stole that phrase from him and, you know, put it in the text of the film. So I really enjoyed that part of the process of writing and trying to use these older texts or these newer inspirations to build the movie, you know, and to find a voice for a character so that he speaks from the 16th century, you know, and feels authentic and feels like a real person. And that process just took so long. I thought, you know, like that was the biggest shock. It's like I spent like 4 years writing, you know, like this movie and whittling it down, you know, making it like so concentrated. But I love that part of the process, you know, like yeah, it was a very rewarding experience, and people still come up with other connections that I hadn't thought of to other parts of the you know, the literary like universe.
Another question about the migrants. In both of your films, there are territories and invisible or visible frontiers, and migrants have an important place. Could you come back on your encounter with them and how during the process they found this place in the film?
I'll go backwards now because I think now, Liz, you'll have more to say about this. In my case, I realized at some point that my character is a migrant. He might be a conqueror, he might be violent, he might be at the top of the food chain, but he's slowly falling. And at the end, he's just a migrant. He's a migrant. And that's something that isn't very much discussed about that time period. All these men that were coming over were migrating, and they were hoping that they could break out of their you know, like the chains of European society. And so that's what we talked about when he actually meets like Central American migrants in the movie. We talked with them about this connection, and it was a really amazing visit. But I want to hear more about what you did in Stray and how you developed that relationship.
Yeah, I want to commend you on your writing. I was really impressed, especially as I feel like a nonfiction filmmaker, how you crafted the voiceover and his thoughts. It all felt so right. It was so hard to toe that line between like what's within taste and yet fantastical enough. But in terms of the people in my film, they had this relationship with Zeytin. So the way I met Zeytin and Nazar, the two dogs who have this close relationship with the migrants, or who are they're Turkmen, which is why they speak Turkish and they understand the language around them, but they're from Syria. And they have come here because of war. And I met them through Zeytin and Nazar as they were Zeytin and Nazar were like running in this underground tunnel packed with people. And we were, you know, at that time we were just searching for who could be our dog protagonists. And the way they were running felt like they had such a purpose. We were like, where are these stray dogs going? It almost felt like, you know, the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. And so we started chasing them and following them. And then they caught up with these young men who were, you know, doing their sort of daily traversing across the city, where they moved from different parts of the city to find ways to make a living. And the dogs would follow them and accompanying them on this journey. And I was really moved by the bond that these two disparate beings had with each other, the dogs being very, in a way, indigenous to Istanbul, and the young men are these people who are passing through at first and now having to settle here, compelled to. And it felt like, for the dogs, being homeless was a very natural state of being. But I think for the boys, of course, it was this huge adjustment to be uprooted from their own homes and now having to, live on the streets and survive in the winters in Istanbul. But for the boys, I knew, like, the reason why they searched out Kartal and have to go and take this puppy from the security guards on the construction site, this drive, and they constantly had this drive. They were always scheming about how to do it. It was, I really think it's because every dog that was added to their pack sort of added to the sense of home and belonging, and that's what the dogs provided. And maybe it was similar for the dogs too. I'm not sure what the dogs were thinking, but so that kind of interdependent bond was really moving to me. And yeah, I think the parallels between marginalized populations and populations that are easily scapegoated, that the tides can turn against overnight, which, at the time when I was filming from 2017 to 2019, I think, the issue of refugees in Turkey, I can't speak authoritatively, but it felt very much like it was not an issue that even politicians there from the right or the left would dare touch, because when I would ask people in the streets, locals, even though Turkey didn't have the infrastructure to be a refuge for these refugees, they still had this policy where they were allowed in, they were allowed to exist, even if they were not supported in the ways that they needed to be. And that people didn't feel as negatively towards them as Western Europe did. They saw them as brethren in need. But I think things have probably changed in the last year as the influx of refugees has increased, and as the economy goes downwards, and as nationalist sentiments rise. So just, I think the humans in the story are undergoing a lot more change than the dogs at the time of filming and beyond filming. But I think there's a lot of parallels there, because in the history of the dogs' lives, it's very much like I don't know if you guys have seen Isle of Dogs by Wes Anderson. That premise is about how this Japanese society exiled all the dogs to an island. I think that actually, I feel like that must have been based on the Turkish story, because this is not included in the film, but as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling in the 1900s, a British diplomat came to Istanbul, and he was chased by a pack of dogs and fell to his death on his own. And the British government, in retaliation, outsized retaliation, forced the Turkish one to round up all their dogs and exile them onto an island where they starved to death. And the Istanbulites who lived there could hear the dogs howling off the mainland and dying. And shortly afterwards, all these huge fires broke out that the stray dogs couldn't warn residents about. And then World War I happened. And so the exiling of the dogs was seen as this curse on Turkey and on Istanbul. And so there's this really spiritual connection that people had. And over the last 100 years, the Turkish government has often tried to eradicate dogs from the streets, persecuted them, because they're trying to westernize or modernize or see Istanbul in a different light. But people fought for their right, they protested. And that's why they have the laws today. And it was only in 2004 that these laws were instituted to allow them to be free and to have the right to exist. So I think the status of things change overnight, which we've seen in our own societies.
Yeah, I really echo the feeling of identifying the plight of migrants who are totally, floating in the air, and stray dogs. I actually, many years ago in 2013, I made a film where I was on the border between US and Mexico, and we kept hearing migrants talk about Border Patrol as the dog pound, and because then that means they're the dogs. So we shot a scene in the film that makes that connection between stray dogs, and in Mexico, they're exterminated at huge numbers, and it was just like really compelling to hear that self-awareness from many migrants who realized, dude, I'm at the bottom. And I think that in your film you really sense that, where they try to make the most of being at the bottom of a very broken social pyramid. And I love the joy also that with which they're filmed, embracing their circumstance without any judgment. You know, things that maybe you and I may not do, but that they're finding joy in, and finding community in, and resisting. It was really fascinating to see that, and heartbreaking also.
Completely. Like for me, every dog that exists there is like this emblem, walking furry emblem, testament of resistance in a way, and to tolerance, and to mercy and scorn, that they're still surviving. And even like in your film, all the people who have experienced this huge trauma of being colonized, and like people are a mix of so many different things now, I think in Mexico, like people having the stories and retaining the culture, or creating new types of culture out of this mixing. It's all testament in the bodies, I think, lived bodies of people, their genetics, like where their genes are from, all of that.
Yeah, I think like just to keep building on that analogy, I think in your film there's a pack, right? There's like there's a family that is made from migrants and dogs, and I feel like in 499 the search is for that family. Where is that pack? Where is that solidarity with the numbers of murdered people that we have? 300,000, you know, like 11 women are attacked or murdered each day. Like, where is the pack? Where is our unit, you know? And I've phrased that in different ways, but I think now talking to you and thinking about our films together, I think about that. Like, where's our pack? Like, what happened that we lost it?
Mm-hmm.
Time is flying with you, so we will have to wrap up. But thank you so much about that wonderful discussion, and about your films, which are really fascinating. For a reminder, they are presented during RIDM from November 12th to November 18th. And thank you again. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you again, Elizabeth and Rodrigo.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us both, and to put our films in conversation with each other.
Yeah, we would have liked to have you in Montreal, but it's already great online. Thank you.
Oh, hold on. I just remembered something. Okay. I wanted to show you this, but I didn't think it was appropriate for the...
Oh.
Shumai. Her name is Shumai.
Dude.